He died long before his time, yet no king of England cast a shadow like his. Beneath silver armor and a royal crest, his flesh blistered, split, and festered. His very body turned against him, rotting from within, while the world still whispered his name in awe. Some called it divine punishment, others called it justice, but for Edward of Woodstock, whom history would name the Black Prince, death was neither fast nor clean. It was slow, sticky, undignified, and it started long before his final breath. He was not born evil, no one is, but he was raised to be something worse, effective. He learned early that mercy wins hearts but loses wars, so he burned it out of himself. With every town he razed in France, with every limb he left twitching in the dirt of Castile, Edward didn't just wage war, he performed it. Like a ritual, like a doctrine. And Europe watched, breath held, as a prince turned into a weapon. But here's the thing about weapons, they break. And when they do, they don't shatter with glory, they rust. They swell, they stink. He wasn't the first. Decades earlier, a giant of a man named Bohemond carved his way across Anatolia under the cross, promising salvation through slaughter. They crowned him a saint in the west and a devil in the east. Sound familiar? And he wasn't the last either, because not long after Edward's corpse collapsed under the weight of its own infection, a barefoot girl in chainmail rose from the fields of Domremy. Where he had burned France, she would burn for it. They called her Joan, they called her mad, and they killed her for believing. 3 souls, 3 flames, each consumed by the same plague, belief whether in war, blood, or God. But before Joan burned, and long after Bohemond faded into legend, there was the boy they swore would save the crown. The prince who never became king. The man who made France tremble and whose own body turned into his prison. Before the death, before the disease, there was Edward, and the war that made him. He wasn't born screaming. That was the first sign. They said the midwives waited in silence, holding their breath, wondering if the baby had died before he'd even begun. But then he opened his eyes, quiet, cold, already studying. Edward of Woodstock, firstborn son to a king, a child molded not in the warmth of court, but in the steel of expectation. From the moment he could stand, they gave him not toys, but weapons. He was taught to read war before poetry, to speak tactics before prayers. And when other boys were told to be noble, he was told to be necessary. They dressed him like a prince, but trained him like a knife. His childhood was measured not in birthdays, but in victories won by his ancestors, maps of France stained red by the sins of his lineage. They said he never smiled without reason, never wept when beaten, and never looked away from a bleeding thing. Servants said he walked the halls like he'd already seen the place burn. His father adored him, not like a son, like a future, like a weapon still being sharpened. By 12, he could recite the deaths of every Plantagenet king in reverse order. By 13, he stopped asking questions. He didn't need answers anymore, just targets. The war with France had flared back open, and while England sharpened its swords, Edward said nothing, just waited, quiet, focused, ready. When the campaign began, his tutors begged the king not to send the boy. The king didn't even flinch. Because Edward III didn't see a child, he saw what he needed. So the boy sailed with the army, and somewhere between the coast of Dover and the fields of northern France, something inside him shifted. He stopped looking at people. He started calculating them. Stature, distance. How long they'd take to bleed. No one noticed it then. But later, much later, after the fires, after the kings fell, after the rot set in, they would whisper about this boy. Not the man he became, not the crown he never wore, but the boy, because that's when it started, before the battles, before the plague, before the screams. What they buried in silver and called a hero had already stopped being human before his first kill. It didn't thunder at Crecy, it whispered. The sky hung low, thick with smoke and rot, and beneath it, a boy stood still in the mud, 13 years old, calm as if the world wasn't ending around him. But Edward wasn't watching the battlefield. He was listening to it. Every dying horse, every cough of blood, every breath cut short by an arrow, he absorbed it like scripture. They thought this was his test. He treated it like rehearsal. The French came by the thousands, armored, noble, loud. They laughed before the charge. They didn't laugh after. Edward had positioned his archers in rows like reapers. When the command came, the sky turned black. Arrows rained with no rhythm, no mercy, no God. Men screamed and fell on top of each other, clawing for air, for ground, for a direction that wasn't death. But there was none. The field gave them nowhere to run, just places to die slower. He didn't lead like a prince. He calculated like a surgeon. He moved soldiers the way a butcher sharpens knives. The wounded were ignored. The surrendered were trampled. One French knight crawled to Edward's horse, half a jaw left, muttering for mercy. Edward stared at him for a long time, not speaking. Then he turned his horse and rode on, leaving the man to choke in the blood of his own language. Crecy wasn't victory, it was awakening. Something inside him cracked open that day, not with pride, but with clarity. Death wasn't the price of war, it was the product, and he liked the way it sounded. They stopped calling him a boy. They stopped looking him in the eyes. When he returned to England, the crowds cheered, but he didn't hear them. He heard something else, still echoing from the mud, a sound like breathing, but not human. It didn't ask him to come back. It promised it would wait. And when he did return, it wasn't with hope or strategy or even rage. It was with precision, with ritual, with the patience of rot. And what he did next didn't end with a scream. It ended with a king begging to be remembered. Poitiers was supposed to be a correction. The French wanted revenge for Crecy, wanted their dignity back, their king to ride out in gold and restore what Edward had cracked. But Edward didn't come to fight a king, he came to unmake one. His army was outnumbered, his supplies were dwindling. The smart move was retreat, but Edward didn't retreat, he smiled. Then he started choosing which parts of the battlefield would become Grave. He shaped it like a trap, layered it with elevation and narrow paths, designed not to defeat an army, but to crush its confidence. The French knights charged, not once, not twice, 3 times. And each time they ran straight into his teeth. Arrows, mud, sharpened stakes, and English calm. Panic spread faster than the blood. By midday, the screams weren't of battle, they were of realization. They weren't going to win. They weren't going to escape. And in the middle of it all, Jean II of France, the king himself, was dragged from his horse, thrown into the blood-drenched mud, and forced to surrender to a man 20 years younger. But Edward didn't kill him, he didn't execute, he didn't humiliate, not visibly. He offered the king a seat, he poured him wine, he spoke gently, and in that kindness he carved a deeper wound than any blade could. Because Edward understood something most generals never did. Fear doesn't end when a king dies. It spreads when a king lives, defeated, chained, paraded like a breathing trophy. He brought Jean back to London, not as prisoner, but as warning. From that point on, Edward stopped being a soldier. He became a message. Every campaign grew theatrical. Each maneuver was not just tactical, it was symbolic. Cities weren't just conquered, they were demonstrated. His enemies weren't defeated, they were displayed. He no longer fought to win, he fought to teach. But even that wasn't enough, because somewhere in him, something darker was still unsatisfied. What he did in France had been brilliant, but brilliance fades. He wanted something more permanent. He wanted to do something the world wouldn't forget. So he turned south, toward Castile, toward a land already trembling. Not for conquest, not even for coin, but for what comes when a man no longer sees war as means, but as faith. The next slaughter wouldn't be remembered as strategy, it would be remembered as a curse. They told him Castile would be simple, a brief campaign, a gesture of allegiance. Pedro the Cruel had promised gold, soldiers, and a throne soaked in treason, but what Edward brought wasn't diplomacy, it was doctrine. This wasn't France. This was something else, something older, hotter, more superstitious. A land where saints burned beside heretics and every hill had already tasted blood. The Black Prince arrived not as a liberator, not even as an invader, but as an omen. And Spain understood what was coming long before the screaming began. He cut through the countryside like rot through meat. Entire villages vanished behind him. Monks were dragged from stone chapels and hung from the bells they once rang. Livestock were gutted and nailed to the walls of their own barns. Peasants who resisted were slaughtered. Peasants who submitted vanished. It wasn't conquest, it was purification. Edward fought no great battles here, not at first. Only rituals, and each one was bloodier than the last. At Nájera, he staged his masterpiece. Pedro's enemies, Henry of Trastamara and the Castilian rebels, stood across the field, proud, numerous, confident. But Edward didn't see men, he saw offerings. He arranged his forces with the cold elegance of a surgeon dissecting a corpse. When the charge came, he let it crash. Then he crushed it from both flanks, collapsing the enemy like lungs around a scream. They begged to flee, he let them, and then he hunted them, through dust, through vineyards, through churches. His soldiers laughed while stabbing, and Edward, ever composed, rode silently through it all, counting. After the slaughter, he walked the battlefield, boots wet with blood and wine. Survivors were dragged to his feet, pleading. One Castilian knight tried to bribe him with land. Edward didn't speak. He just looked down and asked, "Do you know what rot smells like before it shows?" Then he rode on. He had won everything, but something was wrong. His hands ached, his breath came thick, his joints pulsed with a fever no sword could cut. The inside of his armor grew damp, not with sweat, but with something slower, darker, deeper. At night, he woke choking. His skin itched where there were no wounds. He stopped looking in mirrors. And when he touched the cup to his lips, the wine tasted like metal. The war was over, but the rot had only just begun. It started with the hands, just a stiffness, barely noticeable at first. Then the swelling, the heat, the ache. By the time Edward could no longer fasten his own gauntlets, he knew this wasn't exhaustion, this wasn't age. This was something else, something alive beneath the skin, chewing its way out. His physicians called it inflammation, a noble word for what was clearly rot. Some whispered it was poison. Others said it was divine punishment for what he'd done in Castile, but Edward never asked for a cure. He'd lived long enough in armor to know when a wound couldn't be closed. He kept fighting, of course, kept pretending. Even as his breath shortened, even as his joints screamed with every step, even as the stench of infection clung to his clothes like a second skin, he began avoiding mirrors. The flesh around his eyes darkened. His spit turned black. His fingers curled inward and refused to uncurl. He still rode with the court, still dined in public, still smiled at soldiers who worshipped him, but under the table he bled. Under the armor, his skin blistered and peeled in strips. He could no longer hold a sword for more than a few minutes, and so he stopped drawing it altogether, not out of weakness, but out of shame. No one dared speak of it. The Black Prince had become too large to question. He was a legend now, immortal in name, even as his body betrayed every breath. But the rot didn't care. It spread through his gut, his lungs, his spine. His groin began to leak. He smelled like damp wood and wet iron. At night, the servants lit incense to mask the air around his tent. Some fainted, one wept. Edward didn't flinch. He'd stood in fields full of corpses. This was no different, except now the corpse was him. He tried to return to Aquitaine to rule, but he couldn't stay upright in council. He vomited blood mid-sentence. Once, while trying to walk unaided, he collapsed and shattered 3 of his own ribs. From that day forward, they carried him. Not like a prince, like a relic, but relics don't rule. Relics don't lead armies. Relics rot quietly, waiting to be sealed behind stone. He knew what was coming. He could feel it in the bone, not death, exposure. A lifetime of violence finally peeling through the shell. He no longer saw the battlefield in dreams. He saw a bed, a room, a body left alone long enough to start dripping. And the worst part wasn't the pain. It was knowing they would all lie about it. They would say he died with dignity, that he passed peacefully, that England's golden prince slipped away like a whisper, but Edward knew better. And so did the servants who found the stains long before they found the breath. The man who had once silenced kings would die trying not to scream, and what came next was quieter still. They stopped calling him the Black Prince to his face, not out of respect, but because the title had started to feel literal. His fingertips were turning purple. The skin around his ribs cracked when touched. His breath came sour, thick, like smoke from wet bone, and yet they still dressed him in silver. They still placed him in the saddle, bolted upright by leather straps and false posture. The people cheered when they saw him pass. They didn't know what they were looking at. He wasn't a prince anymore. He was a corpse in denial. He still attended council, still signed decrees, still played the part of statesman. But every movement was theater, every appearance choreographed to hide what was leaking beneath. Beneath the velvet, there were bandages. Beneath the bandages, infection. Beneath the infection, bone. His attendants carried herbs, cloth, vials of perfume, and buckets. Behind closed doors, his groans were mistaken for thunder. When he stood, it was with help. When he sat, it was carefully, as if something inside might spill. Once during a feast, his stomach ruptured in silence. He nodded, raised a toast, and was carried out before the blood reached the floor. The court pretended not to notice. That was the arrangement. England needed its lion. France needed its nightmare, so they all agreed to let the rot wear armor and pretend to speak. But not everyone was fooled. His own son had begun to pull away. His wife no longer slept beside him. One night, a knight who had once served him at Crecy refused to enter his chamber, said the smell was unnatural, said it reminded him of the plague. Edward didn't punish him, he simply turned away. The infection had spread to his spine by then, turning was all he could do, and still he clung to presence, still clung to image, because he knew what was coming, and he feared it not for himself, but for what it would reveal, not the rot. The silence. When he was gone, there would be no thunder, no clash of armies, just whispers, just lies, just a tomb too small for the weight of everything he'd buried inside. He began refusing food, refusing light, refusing mirrors. They said he was meditating, preparing for death, but truth is he'd already died. This was just the part no one wanted to watch. Soon even the armor would be too heavy. And when it came off, there would be no legend left inside, only stains. Only skin too soft to hold together. Only a man who once broke kings, now breaking inch by inch. And when he could no longer be lifted to the throne room, they brought the throne to his bed. That's when they knew it was ending. But it wasn't the kind of end anyone had prepared for, because not every king dies in battle. Some of them rot alive until God gets bored. They stopped calling him the Black Prince to his face, not out of respect, but because the title had started to feel literal. His fingertips were turning purple. The skin around his ribs cracked when touched. His breath came sour, thick, like smoke from wet bone, and yet they still dressed him in silver. They still placed him in the saddle, bolted upright by leather straps and false posture. The people cheered when they saw him pass. They didn't know what they were looking at. He wasn't a prince anymore. He was a corpse in denial. He still attended council, still signed decrees, still played the part of statesman. But every movement was theater, every appearance choreographed to hide what was leaking beneath. Beneath the velvet, there were bandages. Beneath the bandages, infection. Beneath the infection, bone. His attendants carried herbs, cloth, vials of perfume, and buckets. Behind closed doors, his groans were mistaken for thunder. When he stood, it was with help. When he sat, it was carefully, as if something inside might spill. Once during a feast, his stomach ruptured in silence. He nodded, raised a toast, and was carried out before the blood reached the floor. The court pretended not to notice. That was the arrangement. England needed its lion. France needed its nightmare, so they all agreed to let the rot wear armor and pretend to speak. But not everyone was fooled. His own son had begun to pull away. His wife no longer slept beside him. One night, a knight who had once served him at Crecy refused to enter his chamber, said the smell was unnatural, said it reminded him of the plague. Edward didn't punish him, he simply turned away. The infection had spread to his spine by then, turning was all he could do, and still he clung to presence, still clung to image, because he knew what was coming, and he feared it not for himself, but for what it would reveal, not the rot. The silence. When he was gone, there would be no thunder, no clash of armies, just whispers, just lies, just a tomb too small for the weight of everything he'd buried inside. He began refusing food, refusing light, refusing mirrors. They said he was meditating, preparing for death, but truth is he'd already died. This was just the part no one wanted to watch. Soon even the armor would be too heavy. And when it came off, there would be no legend left inside, only stains. Only skin too soft to hold together. Only a man who once broke kings, now breaking inch by inch. And when he could no longer be lifted to the throne room, they brought the throne to his bed. That's when they knew it was ending. But it wasn't the kind of end anyone had prepared for, because not every king dies in battle. Some of them rot alive until God gets bored. He never wore the crown, but the crown wore him. Every scar Edward earned, every scream he left behind, every limb he shattered under English banners, none of it vanished when his body did. It clung, it passed down, it bled forward. His son, Richard, was just 9 when he watched the court wrap his father's corpse in silence. They told the boy it was peaceful, that Edward had died with dignity, but the servants wouldn't let him near the bed. They'd already scrubbed the floor twice, and the linens had been burned. They crowned Richard II barely a year later, a child propped up by men who whispered about legacy while hiding the stench of it. The boy was bright, imaginative, soft-handed, none of the iron his father carried, none of the blood, and that terrified them. So they tried to mold him, to bend him into the image of the man who had just liquefied in front of them. But Richard wasn't a weapon, he wasn't built to rot, he was built to dream, and dreams don't survive in England. Edward's legend was too big to bury, and so they stitched it into his son's shadow. Every rebellion that stirred, they asked why Richard wasn't like his father. Every loss, every hesitation, every decision not laced with fire, why can't you be more like the Black Prince? But Richard hadn't been at Crecy. He hadn't gutted Castile. He hadn't been baptized in war. He'd been baptized in absence. And no one survives growing up in the echo of a god. Edward of Woodstock left behind no kingdom, no great reform, no written doctrine. Just a myth soaked in iron and illness, a face carved into tombs, a name whispered across battlefields like a curse, and a boy too young, too soft, and too alone to carry it. They remember him now as a hero. But those who cleaned the sheets, who sealed the room, who watched his body bloat and split, they didn't see a hero. They saw what war does when it outlives its purpose. They saw the cost of legend. He wasn't the first to leave a kingdom in ruin. He wasn't the last. Bohemond had done it before, marching east with holy rage and leaving only bones behind. And years later, a girl named Joan would rise barefoot in the fields Edward once burned, wielding not hatred, but faith. And for that they'd burn her too, but between them stood the Black Prince, the one who never ruled, yet ruled through terror, the one who never fell in battle, but fell inch by inch until even the flies grew tired. Some kings die. Some are killed, but Edward was peeled away, and what was left was nothing but silence. He never got his throne, but he got something heavier, something colder, a place in history where the armor never comes off, where the screams keep echoing, where the victory never rots as fast as the body beneath it. They called him the Black Prince, not for what he wore, but for what he became. But he wasn't the first to baptize nations in fire. Before him, there was Bohemond, the crusader who marched east with holy bloodlust, who preached salvation with a sword and vanished behind a trail of ash. And after him, there was Joan, a girl who walked barefoot into war, hearing voices no one else could, and burned for the one thing Edward never understood: belief. The armor changes, The faces change, but the war keeps dreaming. We'll see you in the next story, where the blood speaks louder than the crown, and the crown always demands more.